Chris Janasek is a research professor at Oregon State University and the co-lead of the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group. Jenny Schmidt is the Watershed Monitoring Coordinator at the South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve in Oregon, and Katrina Poppy is a research associate at Western Washington University and a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia.
All right. Welcome, everybody. So my name is Jenny Schmidt, and I'm speaking from South Slough Reserve on the southern Oregon coast. That's the traditional homelands of the Mille Coos people. And on that note, before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the connection of the many Indigenous peoples to their traditional lands that this project encompassed, which was quite vast, as we'll see. I also want to recognize the amazing team of people who made this project happen. So as Nick mentioned, today you're going to hear from Chris Janasek, who led the project and is with Oregon State University, and Katrina Poppy with Western Washington University. And we'll be talking to you about how elevation capital, vegetation development, and blue carbon processes have evolved in some of the oldest tidal wetland projects on the West Coast. So I wanted to set the stage and give this project some context. I'd like to start with the fact that in the US, many wetlands have been lost since historic times. This is often from diking, draining, converting wetlands into lands for agricultural development or urban areas or other human uses. Um, so on the West Coast, work from Laura Brophy and colleagues used elevation-based estuary extent mapping to estimate the tidal wetland losses on the US West Coast. Where they found an overall loss of 85% of vegetated tidal wetlands from historic times. So this upper right map is showing you the California estuaries used in Brophy's analysis. And the bar graph next to it illustrates the percent estuarine wetland loss. Up here, this is the axis for percent loss, and that's associated with these blue bars. And then on the lower axis, loss in hectares associated with those gray bars. And that's for each of the estuaries in California that they looked at. And so just to give you an idea of what that kind of looks like, zoomed in on the bottom left is a San Francisco Bay estuary marsh area. And that's kind of visually depicting what the loss of historical wetlands in San Pablo Bay looks like. So basically that red is that elevation extent modeling showing historical extent of wetlands. And then the green is using National Wetland Inventory or NWI data to show today, like current time, what's remaining for those tidal vegetated wetlands. So in this example, this is basically visualizing what a 75% loss of tidal wetlands looks like. And then similarly, this is showing the Oregon and Washington estuaries that were assessed by Brophy and her colleagues, again with an accompanying bar chart showing the extent of tidal wetlands lost at each estuary. So Coos Bay, where I'm from, is showing a 70% loss of tidal wetlands since historic times. So luckily, many laws are now in place to help slow the loss of wetlands. And for a number of years now, wetland restoration programs have been acting to help reverse some of these losses by converting lands back to tidal influence. An example you can see on the left is one such tidal wetland in Coos Bay estuary here in Oregon. The top picture is showing an old aerial photograph of a diked agricultural area, and the bottom picture is showing it 27 years after restoration when it was reintroduced to tidal influence again. So funding for tidal wetland restoration has really accelerated over the past few decades. Often this funding is tied to species co-benefits, like in the Pacific Northwest, coho salmon, in California, endangered rails, or with enhancement of ecosystem services in mind, like flood mitigation. And then focus in recent years has also been to alleviate further loss of tidal wetlands due to sea level rise. So many restoration funding programs, while there are lots of them, they have limited funds for monitoring. Those funds are usually tied to short-term effectiveness monitoring for adaptive management purposes. So many, many millions of dollars have been spent on tidal wetland restoration over the decades, but there's still really limited information on how these types of projects are evolving over time. So this is the type of information that can really inform how effective restoration was in meeting its long-term goals and also in forming new restoration designs. So this project, which we dubbed Maria, really aimed to assess the long-term outcomes of tidal wetland restoration. So elevation capital, vegetation development, and carbon sequestration are really the basis for many valued tidal wetland functions that we talk about. Um, some examples are like productivity and sediment capture and habitat provisioning and sea level rise resilience and carbon capture and storage. And so we selected the oldest restoration projects on the West Coast to assess these three attributes. We used existing and new data sets to learn how wetland elevations change, how vegetation communities develop, and how restored wetlands can sequester carbon over the long term. So to do this in the most impactful way, we wanted to involve a really kind of a wide variety of end users. So shortly after the start of the project in 2022, in the fall, we invited a whole suite of end users to help guide the project. And these included folks that were wetland restoration practitioners, grant funders, coastal managers, natural resource protection agencies, other wetland experts. So we had a nice introductory meeting, and then following that, we invited end users to attend our technical advisory committee to provide more in-depth feedback on the methods that we wanted to use or the data that existed. We hosted a second rather large end user meeting early in 2024 so that we could convey our preliminary findings. And then we held a final hybrid workshop in the fall of 2024 to discuss our major results and our next steps. And this workshop included site visits to three of the older restoration sites in the South Slough Reserve. One is pictured here. And throughout the project, our end users really provided really valuable insights. They asked really good questions, and we had really good discussion with them. And one of the things that was the most valuable to us early on was help from end users on site selection. Um, they really had a lot of knowledge on sites that existed, for example, how to access them if they were even accessible, knowledge of existing data for those sites. So the sites that we chose were ultimately chosen with comparability and feasibility in mind. We wanted to know, for example, was there a suitable reference site that was relatively close to the restored site and had similar geomorphology and was a similar size? So an example of that you can see here on the right is Muzzy Marsh, and it's a reference marsh nearby in the San Francisco Bay. We also wanted to know, was there existing data already available? Or if new data were needed, were sites reasonably accessible? Could we fit data collection at those sites into our time frame and our budget? But really, I guess the biggest consideration was site age. We chose sites that were restored at least 20 years prior because we really wanted to assess those long-term outcomes. So what we ended up with was 16 paired restored and reference wetlands in 9 estuaries from northern Washington to southern California. These restored sites were between 21 and 64 years in age. And then, as will be noted by Chris and Katrina when they go over their methods and findings, one site in southern Oregon was divided into 4 kind of different treatments at the time of restoration. And so that we consider those as 4 different restored wetlands. So I'm going to pass it over to Chris now to talk about our approach and our findings for elevation and vegetation development.
All right, thanks, Jenny, for that great background for this project. So I'm going to go over the results that we obtained for wetland elevation and vegetation, also briefly touch on the methods that we use for the new data collection. And then when I'm finished, Katrina is going to tell you about the blue carbon results. So Jenny laid out these 16 pairs of sites that we had up and down the West Coast. And at each site, we decided to use a field transect approach, which is pretty common when NERRS are doing their normal monitoring. Our transects started from random start points at the upland, usually at the upland boundary of a site, and they extended along the site's elevation gradients so that we kind of captured different plant zones and different elevation zones at the site. We used an even point spacing. We aimed for about 25 vegetation points and about 50 elevation points per site. So the sites varied considerably in size. So the spacing varied as well. And the main, I don't have a lot of method slides, but the main methods that we used to determine elevation were to look at marsh surface elevation using RTK GNSS. So there are RTK networks in each of the 3 Western states. And we used a field rover to connect to those statewide networks and then obtained elevations along the transects in the North American vertical datum of 1988. Now, the tide range varies quite a bit along the west coast of the United States. It about doubles from Southern California up to Washington. So we converted all of those NAVD 88 values into standardized tidal elevations, which are known as Z-star. And we use various NOAA data to do that, but we also deployed a water level logger in the Nisqually estuary because there hasn't been a good historical NOAA gauge in that estuary for a long time. So I'm going to show the wetland results for elevation in a couple of slides. And I've divided up the sites into several groups because each of these wetland projects really had different management and different engineering approaches when they were restored historically. So the first set are sites where elevation was unmanipulated. These are sites where usually the levee was completely removed or breached in places, but there was no modification of the wetland surface at the time of restoration. Many of these sites had been diked for 100 years or more. So during that period, they experienced some level of subsidence. The little codes on the top indicate the estuary and group in which they occur. And generally we go from south to north. Elkhorn Slough in California is the southernmost unmanipulated site, and then the Skagit estuary in Washington here. And this relatively busy slide, but you can see that in 7 of the 8 marsh sites where elevation was unmanipulated, the restored site actually had lower elevation capital than the reference site. The one exception was the site on the Columbia River where we actually could not find a good reference site immediately adjacent to the restoration project. So we had to go a couple of kilometers upriver, and these might differ a little bit in terms of their hydrogeomorphology. The dashed lines on these figures indicate those standard tidal elevations. So to kind of interpret these, 0 is mean tide level. That's a spot in the estuary that's inundated about 50% of the time. And then 1.0 is mean high water. So that's a part of the estuary that would be inundated about 8 to 10% of the time. We had 2 sites in the project. These were both in Southern California, where fill was actually removed in order to restore tidal influence to the projects. The sites were in Tijuana Estuary and Carpinteria Marsh. Each of these was about 22 to 28 years old. And at Tijuana Estuary, we did find that the restored site had lower elevation capital than its reference marsh. However, the elevations were at about 1.0, so they were at about mean high water, which is pretty good elevation capital for a West Coast marsh. At Carpinteria, we actually found that the restored site was higher in elevation than the reference marsh. And then the last set of sites were locations along the West Coast where fill was added at the time of restoration. So some of these projects had some foresight in thinking about sea level rise even decades ago, and they added fill to kind of compensate for the loss of elevation that you often see in a diked wetland. So 2 of the sites here in San Francisco Bay, this is our parasites in South Bay and then in the Mid Bay. These actually, we saw no difference between the restored and reference elevations. And one site in San Pablo Bay, we did see somewhat lower elevation in the restored wetland. But again, this is close-ish to mean higher high water, so and well vegetated. So we think this one is doing all right. The Coos Bay sites were complicated because, as Jenny mentioned, there was actually an experimental project in this site to develop, when it was restored, to develop different elevation steps and sort of test that elevation impact on wetland recovery. So some of these cells were doing really well. They had high elevation capital, whereas others were considerably lower than their reference marsh. So along these same transects where we assessed elevation capital, we also wanted to look at vegetation communities. As Jenny prefaced, vegetation is important for lots of ecosystem functions and services in tidal wetlands. So we wanted to look at plant communities and assess where these projects were decades later. We looked at a number of different vegetation metrics. We did look at macroalgae, which are often ignored in wetland assessments, but are important for nutrient cycling and productivity. We looked at plant species cover, and we looked at plant species richness. At each of these plant quadrats, we also looked at the elevation. We had that from our RTK work, and we also assessed pore water salinity. We typically surveyed about 20 to 25 plots per site, some a little more, some a little less. All right, we found macroalgae in about 28% of the plots, so almost a third of these locations had macroalgae. We didn't really go down to species level because that's hard to do in the field, but we were able to kind of look at the major macroalgal groups. Green algae were present. This kind of cool moss-like alga, it's not a moss, looks a lot like moss in a forest, Vaucheria, was present in a number of locations, and occasionally we would have larger seaweeds. These data summarize the macroalgal cover across all of the 16 pairs of sites in the project. Again, in the upper left, we're starting in Southern California and proceeding all the way up to Washington in the lower right. And a lot of sites really didn't have much macroalgal cover, as you can see, but there were a few estuaries where macroalgae were quite common. So Carpinteria in the Santa Barbara area, Elkhorn Slough in Central California, and the Nisqually sites actually had a fair amount of macroalgal cover. In terms of plant communities, there's a lot of tidal wetland plant species on the West Coast. We found 85 in our quadrats. There are more because clearly we missed some of the rare species. But these are the 8 most common species. So we have pickleweed, we have some sedges, we have some succulent species, and some grasses. And one of the first metrics we wanted to look at was the total plant cover of all these species across the site. Now, plant cover in the way we did assessments could exceed 100%. So if there was vegetation layering and different canopies of plants, you could get up to maybe 250% cover. So this figure shows those, again, restored and referenced differences from Southern California up to Washington. And again, a very busy slide when you look at individual sites, but by and large, you can see that most of the restoration projects are fairly well vegetated. However, there are a number of sites where there is lower vegetation cover overall at the restored site. And I'll return to that in a minute and when I talk about plant diversity. We did find some non-native plant species in our project sites we assessed. And of course, managers are concerned about the spread of non-native species. And we sort of wondered whether restored sites would have more non-natives than reference marshes. These are some of the common ones. So in the Pacific Northwest, reed canary grass is a problem. Typha angustifolia is a problem in some Washington estuaries. And in California, this is Russian thistle, and a number of non-native species can be present in some of those wetlands. These are the overall non-native plant cover results. And one of the interesting things that jumped out right away is that we had very low cover of non-native species in California. Now, this is not because there are no non-natives in California. It's just that the California sites that we studied tended to be very saline or even hypersaline. And the prevalence of non-natives is often tied more to salinity. So when you do get into some of the fresher wetlands in California, you do see more prevalence of non-native species. But our particular sites tended to be pretty saline, so there were not a lot of non-native plants. In contrast, in the Pacific Northwest, a number of our sites did have greater cover of non-native species. And the results really varied by estuary. So in some of these Coos Bay sites, for example, the restored wetland had more non-natives than the reference. But in the Salmon River estuary in Central Oregon, for example, we saw the opposite pattern. One of the additional things we wanted to look at was plant diversity. So we assessed this at the plot scale. So we counted all of the species that were present in our small quadrats. We also looked at plant diversity at the site scale as well. So again, kind of a busy figure here, but if you sort of glance over the results, you'll see that a number of sites have lower plant diversity in the restored marsh than in the reference marsh. This was particularly pronounced at some of the Coos Bay sites. Also this site in San Francisco Bay and the two sites in Nisqually. So we looked at plant diversity at the site scale as well, and the method we used here is a species accumulation curve, also known as a rarefaction curve. So these simply plot then as you increase your sample size at a particular area, you expect to see an increase in cumulative species that are encountered. And you can compare sites by kind of producing these polygons that look at that sampling versus species richness relationship. So I'm just showing two sites here to illustrate some of the patterns that we saw. So at the pair of Frederickson sites in Coos Bay, these are actually relatively fresher, high elevation tidal marshes. These were quite diverse, and we actually saw a pretty good overlap between the restored and reference marsh, suggesting that overall those sites had about the same species richness. In contrast, at Muzzy Marsh in San Francisco Bay, this is a more saline site. Diversity overall is lower. And you can see that as you sample more and more plots, these curves diverge. And so this suggests that the reference site here has more overall richness than the restored marsh. Now this figure, there's a lot of data in those previous slides and some other data I didn't have time to show. But one of the things we wanted to do also was to kind of get the big picture, you know, what's happening along the whole coast. Clearly, these are individual projects. They have different ages and histories, but are there patterns that we can see along the entire West Coast in this sample set? So we use an effect size metric called Cohen's G. These are effect sizes are often used in meta-analyses when you want to pool together lots of data from many different studies. In this case, we have one study, but many different sites across the West Coast. And you can calculate that effect size and confidence intervals for it. And that's what I plotted here for the 4 plant metrics that we talked about: total plant cover, macroalgal cover, non-natives, and then plant species richness. So any of the points above 0 on this figure indicate that that metric was higher in the restored site. And then points below indicate that the metric was higher in the reference marsh. So there's some overlap of confidence intervals here on these figures, but also a few general patterns that emerge. So overall, reference sites do tend to have higher total plant cover. And we see not quite significant, but pretty good trend that there's lower species richness in restored sites and higher species richness in reference marshes. Also, overall, there tends to be higher macroalgal cover. And this may be due to the fact that plants and macroalgae compete in some ways for light. So if you have high densities of plants in your marsh, you have low light availability for benthic macroalgae. And so that may be a relationship there. All right, that's it. I'm gonna turn it now over to Katrina, who will talk about the blue carbon work.
All right, hi everyone. So yeah, I'll be talking about the third of our 3 major topics of study for this project, and that is blue carbon. So for the blue carbon component of the Maria project, we focused on soil. So that's where we got all our information. And that's because well, this graph here shows where the carbon is stored for a few different ecosystems. And for the salt marshes here, you can see that only a small fraction is stored in the living plant biomass, while the vast majority is stored in the soil. So that's why we focus on soil measurements for long-term carbon sequestration types of questions. And so we took many soil cores for this project, and we can use soil cores to answer two different questions generally. One is the carbon stock. So how much carbon is currently stored in the soil, and this tells us what might be lost if that wetland were disturbed. And then carbon accumulation rate. So how quickly is that carbon accumulating? It tells us how that site contributes to fighting climate change on a day-to-day basis. Both are valuable bits of information, but they have sort of different implications. And I often like to point out that a high carbon stock does not always mean a high rate, so they're not necessarily correlated. But for this project, we gathered information for both, but we're mainly interested in the second, the rates, because if we're looking at a bunch of restored marshes, we're probably not so worried about them being disturbed again anytime soon. So this is how we calculate the carbon accumulation rate, simply the product of carbon density, how much carbon is stored in the soil, by the accretion rate, how quickly is the soil accumulating vertically, to give us the carbon accumulation rate. And in the following results slides, I'll generally be showing results for all three of these components. So not just the carbon accumulation rate by itself, but so that if we see trends in carbon accumulation rates, we can see if it's maybe attributed more to carbon density or to the accretion rates. First, we'll look at just which of those two parts of the equation have more influence on the resulting carbon accumulation rate. And these are just data from this project. So I said earlier that carbon accumulation rate is the product of carbon density on the left and accretion rate on the right. But we can see here that the accretion itself is a much better predictor of carbon accumulation rate in this region. And so carbon density or carbon stocks do not correlate very well with carbon accumulation rate. And I think that just has to do with the range of variability in each of those variables, since mathematically they both contribute. So I said that a high carbon stock does not necessarily imply a high carbon accumulation rate, and so that's supported by this plot. So if we were looking for high carbon accumulation rates, we want to look for high accretion rates, which of course has the co-benefit of providing resilience to sea level rise. Now some more results. So here is soil carbon density in restored and reference marshes by estuary. So restored marshes are in blue on the left, and their reference counterparts are in green on the right. And in some estuaries, the reference marshes have significantly higher soil carbon density, and I've outlined those estuaries in red here. And the other estuaries were deemed not significantly different between reference and restored. Now, similarly, here are the sediment accretion rates by estuary. And again, highlighting the estuaries where the restored and reference marshes were significantly different from each other, which is only 2 of the 11 estuaries here. So that means most estuaries have sediment accretion rates that do not significantly differ between the mature restored marshes and the reference marshes. Another question we can ask of those accretion rates is how do they compare to local rates of sea level rise? So this is another measure of resilience. So that's what we're looking at here with the quote accretionary balance, which we've defined as the accretion rate minus the rate of sea level rise. And note that sea level rise rates differ by estuary, but positive values here in an accretionary balance mean that the site is accreting more than the rate of relative sea level rise, while negative is not keeping up with sea level rise, and 0 would be just keeping pace. So here, most sites are keeping up or exceeding the rate of relative sea level rise, which is great news, and many other parts of the world are not so lucky. 2 estuaries have negative accretionary balance in restored sites in the Nisqually and San Francisco estuaries, but those reference marshes are also relatively low. So it's possible that those sites are struggling due to low sediment supply to the estuary rather than some site level limitation. Although it's possible too that those restored sites are having a bit of trouble just hanging on to the sediment that they do receive. But long-term accretion rates are only one indicator of sea level rise resilience. Chris looked at another, which is elevation capital. But this is a good indicator here of how these sites have been doing on the scale of the past few decades. Oh, and this is accretionary balance by elevation as a way to look at resilience to sea level rise in terms of both elevation capital on the x-axis and accretionary balance on the y-axis. And we expected to see accretionary balance decrease with elevation, since we tend to see accretion decrease with elevation, such that you might have resilience in terms of one or the other, but typically not both at the same time. And we do see that generally with these negative linear relationships. We also expected to see those cores with negative accretionary balance, meaning accretion rate is less than the rate of sea level rise, we expected to see those at the higher elevations, since that's where the lower accretion rates are. But we didn't really see that. In fact, the negative accretionary balance observations, there are only a few of them really, but they are from a variety of elevations. And those are down below the dashed line there. And interestingly, they're mostly from restored sites. So maybe some restored sites are just having trouble retaining the sediment that they receive. We'll be looking into this a little bit further. Now on to the resulting carbon accumulation rates. So these look similar to those accretion results, where the majority of estuaries show no significant difference in carbon accumulation rates between mature restored marshes and reference marshes. So this is good news. It means that restored marshes are generally able to recover this ecosystem function of carbon sequestration pretty well. Now here we're looking at those same three blue carbon variables and comparing all restored marshes combined to all reference marshes combined. And first on the left, we see carbon density. It was significantly lower in restored marshes, even those mature 20 to 60-year-old marshes that have had a few decades. So indicating that maybe carbon density is slow to recover. Accretion and carbon accumulation rates, on the other hand, looked comparable between mature restored marshes and reference marshes, indicating that they recover fairly quickly. And here's my last results slide. So I think this is cool. So of all the restored marshes included in this project, we have them plotted here by site age, so the number of years since restoration. And I've also added a few younger sites from other projects. Those are the white dots. And I'm also adding some green shading to show the reference marsh means and errors for reference. So this is a space for time analysis to look at the trajectory of these blue carbon variables over time. And here's what we see. Starting on the left, carbon density increases gradually over time, but sort of reaches reference levels about after about 40 years. But accretion and carbon accumulation rates, while initially quite high, appear to settle down and stabilize around reference levels by about 40 years. And so there have been several studies of younger restored marshes that show accretion and carbon accumulation rates being higher in restored sites than reference sites sort of immediately after restoration. And that's likely because those sites are recovering from subsidence, so they're accreting very quickly initially. But until now, we didn't really have sufficient data from older restored sites to know what happens to those initially high rates over time. Would they stay high forever, or at what point do they come down? So now we have some data to better understand that trajectory of blue carbon over time. So here I'll summarize our main blue carbon findings. First, accretion and carbon accumulation rates, they increase very quickly after restoration, being initially very high, and they appear to stabilize by approximately 40 years. So that when you compare mature restored marshes to reference marshes, they have comparable rates. On the other hand, soil carbon density recovers more slowly, being initially low, with reference marshes more likely to be higher than even mature restored marshes. So if you're interested in how much carbon is sitting in the soil, this takes a while to rebuild, although recall that this has little influence on the carbon accumulation rates. And lastly, most sites we're seeing they're currently keeping up with or exceeding the rate of relative sea level rise. So at least up to now, they are generally looking pretty resilient. So that's it from me. And so I like to think that this is generally a good news talk where restored marshes don't have much trouble regaining the ecosystem service of carbon sequestration. And I'll hand this back to Chris now, I think, so that he can wrap all this up with just a few more slides.
All right, thanks, Katrina. I think the blue carbon results are very cool. So I just have a handful of slides to kind of summarize and talk about some maybe take-home messages in terms of restoration that we assess from this project. So to kind of recap the elevation and sea level rise resiliency part that Katrina ended on, we know that elevation capital varies among these sites. It's a very heterogeneous set of projects and with different histories. So their elevation capital varies, but a number of them are well vegetated and look like they are, at least in the near term, sustainable to rates of sea level rise. Sites that had sediment added at the time of restoration tend to have higher elevation capital than a number of other project sites. And this, of course, I think has direct bearing on thinking about where to restore new projects and also if any sediment supplementation is needed at the time of restoration. The vegetation results were interesting and it really depended in large measure on the metric that one was looking at. Most of the restored sites in the project had relatively high cover, and most of that cover was due to native species. So non-natives, while locally abundant in some cases, were not necessarily more prevalent in the restored sites than in the reference marshes. However, when we looked at diversity and some aspects of composition, which I didn't have too much time to talk about, and structural complexity, it looks like a number of restored sites are lagging. So even though they have pretty good cover and relatively high abundance of native species, the diversity that we see in a reference marsh may not quite match what we hope. And then to summarize Katrina's results in terms of blue carbon, restored marshes do tend to have lower carbon density, but have, for the most part, similar carbon accumulation rates because they tend to have pretty high accretion rates. And as Katrina said, this is great news because it looks like from a blue carbon perspective, restored sites are providing that same service as reference marshes. And just a final slide of some restoration implications. One is that, when we talk about restored marsh recovery, it really is site specific and it really does depend on the metric. So we did find some general patterns across the West Coast, but we found also a lot of very site specific kind of unique circumstances. One thing we didn't have time to talk about is a model that we did run with elevation and salinity and kind of how this related to a number of the vegetation parameters. But elevation and salinity are really key important drivers of processes, both in reference areas and in newly restoring wetlands. When elevation is too low, the site can be vulnerable to sea level rise, and you may get incomplete vegetation development. However, if it's too high, you may have low carbon accumulation. If your potential project is in a low salinity area along the US West Coast, you may be concerned particularly about non-native species because we did find that salinity was pretty strongly correlated with the presence of non-native plants. Because diversity often is lower in these restored sites, even after 2 to 6 decades, managers might think about planting or seeding particular species to boost diversity and get closer to reference conditions. And finally, we think that this project is a really great example of the need for long-term monitoring. There are things that we can learn when we go back in these sites 10, 20, 50 years later and look at their condition. And we also think that this project is a good example of the value of looking at projects in a multi-site capacity, and rather than just focusing on a single project, which we tend to do when we're conducting effectiveness monitoring. So we'd like to thank the National Estuarine Research Reserve Science Collaborative that funded this research and that is hosting this webinar. Lots of land managers and owners provided access to the sites, and we thank all of them. My contact information is here, and I'm sure you're welcome to reach out to Katrina and Jenny as well if you have questions. But I think we have some time for questions before we wrap up.
I see one in here already, so we'll just jump right in. Did your comparison of sites with different rates of sea level rise provide any insights about effects of accelerated sea level rise on accretion rates?
Katrina, do you want to tackle
Yeah, I
that
guess
one?
I can say a bit about that. The well, when I looked at sort of what's driving the accretionary balance, it had very little to do with the rate of sea level rise and a lot more to just to do with the accretion rate. In other words, the accretion rate wasn't really driven by the rate of sea level rise. Um, it tends to be much higher, at least. Yeah, and I've seen that at other sites in this region as well. So, um, it looks like on the West Coast in general, we have um, just maybe a better sediment supply or like a pretty good sediment supply such that it's not limited by the rate of sea level rise. If that makes sense. So I think yeah, I think that answered the question.
Sure. There's a bunch of questions coming in. Okay. We'll see how many we can get through. Let's see. I think Megan typed a few. Were there any visible differences in soil color or texture between restored and reference sites?
Yeah, that's a great question. The sites I probably the different we didn't have time, unfortunately, to look at soil texture. I mean, we did carbon, which was great, but there were a lot of things we simply couldn't measure given the constraints of the project. My feeling is that the soil texture composition probably varied more by estuary than by restored and reference marshes. But I do think that it would be really interesting to look at grain size and some of these other properties and how they may differ between restored and reference marshes.
Yeah, just anecdotally off the top of my head, I don't recall seeing really consistent differences, but at least with these sites.
Sure. We had a follow-up question to you, Katrina. Is it fair to say that the West Coast doesn't have the really high rates of sea level rise that we sometimes see on the Gulf or East Coast?
Yeah, now it's kind of adding to my answer.
Yeah. I think it only came to us. I was just elevating it so that everyone could hear the follow-up.
Oh, right, yeah.
Let's see. Can you briefly describe how you generated the local tidal datum, such as how much data you used and how you calculated it?
Yeah, great question. We really only had to do that for Nisqually. So we we went at a very, very low tide so that we wanted to capture all the tidal datums. So we kind of waded out into the river, Nisqually River, which is right adjacent to our sites, deployed a water level logger. And in that case, we got a 6-month time series of water level. And then we actually used the NOAA tidal datums calculator, which is online, and processed the data that way. And then we got good RTK data to get the elevation of our installation and convert all of that water level data into NAVD88.
See, next question. I know it's a very new scenario, but any comments to offer on how the removal of Klamath River dams could impact the watershed's wetlands?
Yeah, that's a That's a great question. Let me tackle that. I think that the Klamath River dams are quite a bit inland, if I'm not mistaken. I think they're at least 100, 200 miles, um, which is not to say they won't have an impact, but it may take some time for the sediment to move through the system. Um, that's a great question. I have been to the mouth of the Klamath. It's a pretty small estuary. It's not like some of our other Pacific Northwest estuaries where tidal influence goes in tens of kilometers. But yeah, I think that would be a cool system to kind of assess how that dam removal affects sedimentation. Katrina, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that.
Yeah, I haven't been to that estuary, but yeah, but you're right. It might increase accretion rates out there.
We do know in San Francisco Bay, which is, I think it's one of the most fascinating things about the Bay, is that a lot of the sedimentation that occurred in San Francisco Bay over the last 150 years is due to the gold rush. And so there was a lot of mining in the foothills of the Sierra, and just tremendous amounts of sediment moved down the system. But it took many, many decades for that to occur. And research, I think, by the USGS has suggested that about the year 2000, there seemed to be this kind of step change and decrease in sediment availability in San Francisco Bay. And it may simply be that all that gold rush sediment finally kind of exhausted itself. And so the bay may be a little bit more sediment starved than it was 40 or 50 years ago.
Okay. You mentioned the importance of elevation in plantings. Did you research or do you know of any other studies that have looked at habitat zones relative to tidal data?
Yes, well, we published, not to toot my own study, but we did publish a paper in 2019 in Estuaries and Coasts. And it was well before this particular project, but we had data from, I think, 12 sites in that study where we looked at species distributions for the common species on the West Coast as a function of tidal elevation. Um, I think we looked at I want to say about a dozen species, but I can't quite remember at the moment. And we definitely do find some preference for different species for particular elevation bands. But one of the interesting findings in that study is that there's some variability from estuary to estuary. And one interesting example that I can mention, because it was pretty common in this study as well, is that pickleweed, Salicornia, that's a very common species in the more saline wetlands in California. And that tends to occur in kind of the mid-marsh or high marsh zone. But once you go to the Pacific Northwest, Southern Oregon, further north, pickleweed is actually much more common in the low marsh zone. So there is a shift with geography that may be due to competition with other species, or it may be due to the fact that it kind of gets shoved down into the most saline parts of the marshes. Hope that answered the question.
I think so. In the interest of time, we'll just keep moving through them because we have a bunch. Did the majority of the restoration actions occur over a short time span at the beginning, or were there cases where restoration actions were occurring over 5 or more years?
That's a great question. I will also, Jenny, if you have some thoughts, interested in hearing that, but I believe that most of the projects the restoration actions occurred over a relatively short time span. There may have been some pre-restoration excavation of channels or sediment additions, for example. But I can't imagine cases where that was done over like 5+ years. And then the actual hydrologic restoration is usually very rapid. Like once a levee is breached, you get tidal flooding on the very next tide cycle. And so you do get pretty rapid hydrologic change at these project sites.
Thank you. I see one question here in the Q&A that I think we missed, so I'll ask it now. Did any of the sites involve petroleum contamination recovery?
Not that I know of. Yeah, I don't recall.
I don't recall you mentioning it either, but I figured a follow-up question would be good. Okay, quick answer to that one. Another question here. Were any of your sites replenished by the Army Corps of Engineers with their harbor dredged materials?
Um, yes, I can think of one. There might be others, but I can think of one case. So Sonoma Baylands, which is in San Pablo Bay on the north side. Um, I don't know if it's Army Corps of Engineers, but San Francisco Bay is obviously dredged periodically for shipping channels. And the fill that was put into Sonoma Baylands, I believe, was dredge material from the Port of Oakland. So it was probably tested to make sure it was suitable in terms of contaminants to put on that wetland. But there was an interesting arrangement to reuse that dredge material, build up the elevation of Sonoma Baylands before it was open to tidal inundation. The other two San Francisco Bay sites also had some fill, but they were done in the 1970s, 1969 and 1976. So, and I don't fully know the history there. So that's a good question. I would have to look that up.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Um, and there's one more here. So before we wrap up, I'll just say thank you to everybody who did answer questions. If you did ask a question or one occurs to you after the fact, you can still send it to us either through the exit survey or via email. But we'll end it with this last question. A bit of a setup here. Recent estimates suggest that up to 85% of wetlands may no longer be federally protected due to the end of the significant nexus test after Sackett versus EPA. To what extent is this policy shift already contributing to wetland loss, especially in the West Coast? And do you foresee an acceleration in wetland degradation or development because of it?
Yeah, that's an important policy question. I'm not a policy expert. I do think that most of the wetlands on the West Coast are not only protected by some level of federal protection, which, as you mentioned, may be sort of going away. But I think many of them also have pretty strong state level protection as well. So it's hard to imagine really large scale future wetland loss due to development or diking. But it's also we're kind of in crazy times. So who knows?
All right, we are at time. Thank you to everyone for submitting questions and to our panelists. Great job answering questions. We got through all of them. That was a lot. It was like rapid fire, so nicely done.
Awesome.
Um,
Thank you.
as I said, you can feel free to, if you have a question that occurs to you after the fact or that you didn't have time for today, just feel free to send it either via the exit survey, which will launch automatically as soon as you close the webinar, as soon as you leave the session. It'll also go out tomorrow or at the same time the webinar started today, so you'll get a reminder email from us automatically. Other than that, just, stay tuned for the webinar recording. It usually only takes us a day or two to get it processed. So if you're looking out for that, just, check back if it's not available right away. Again, big thank you to our presenters for putting together such great presentations, and we'll see you all in the next one. The next webinar coming up is June 5th, I believe, at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So stay tuned for those announcements as well. And everyone have a good rest of your day.